Chapter 4. Halt and Horace crested a small rise and reined in their horses. Less than a kilometre away, Port Cale was spread out before them. White-painted buildings huddled together at the top of a hill, which swept away down to the harbour itself, a man-made breakwater that stretched out into the sea, then turned at a right angle to form an L-shaped haven for the small fleet moored inside the walls. From where they sat their horses, the ships could be seen only as a forest of masts, jumbled together and indistinguishable as individual craft. The houses on the hill were freshly painted and looked neatly kept. Even in the dull sunshine that was breaking through the overcast, they seemed to gleam. Down the hill and closer to the docks, there was a more utilitarian look to the buildings, and the predominant colour was a dull grey. Typical of any working port, Halt thought. The more genteel people lived on the hill in their spotless homes. The riffraff gathered by the water. Still, he was willing to bet that the spotless homes on the hill held their share of villains and unscrupulous traders. The people who lived there weren't more honest than the others, just more successful. "Isn't that someone we know?" asked Horace. He pointed to where a cloaked figure sat by the side of the road a few 100 metres away, arms wrapped around his knees. Close by him, a small shaggy horse cropped the grass growing at the edge of the drainage ditch that ran beside the road. "So it is," Halt replied, "and he seems to have brought Will with him." Horace glanced quickly at his older companion. He felt his spirits lift with the sally. It wasn't much of a joke, but it was the first one Halt had made since they had left his brother's grave at Dunkilty. The ranger was never a garrulous companion, but he had been even more taciturn than usual over the past few days. Understandable, thought Horace. After all, he had lost his twin brother. Now, the ranger seemed prepared to slough off his depression. Possibly it had something to do with the prospect of imminent action, the young knight thought. "Looks like he's lost a guinea and found a farthing," Horace said, and then added, unnecessarily, "Will, I mean." Halt turned in his saddle to regard the younger man and raised an eyebrow. "I may be almost senile in your eyes, Horace, but there's no need to explain the blindingly obvious to me. I'd hardly have thought you were referring to Tug." "Sorry, Halt." But Horace couldn't help a smile touching the corner of his mouth. First a joke, and now an acerbic reply. That was better than the morose silence that had enshrouded Halt since his brother's death. "Let's see what's troubling him," Halt said. He made no discernible movement or signal to his horse that Horace could notice, but Abelard immediately moved off at a slow trot. Horace touched his heels to kick his ribs, and the battle horse responded, quickly catching up to the smaller horse and settling beside him. As they drew near, Will stood, brushing himself off. Tug whinnied a greeting to Abelard and Kicker, and the other horses responded in kind. "Halt! Horace!" Will greeted them as they drew rein beside him. "I hoped you'd be along today." "We got the message you left for us at Fingal Bay," Halt told him, "so we pushed on early this morning." Fingal Bay had been Tennyson's original destination. It was a prosperous trading and fishing port some kilometres to the south of Port Cale. The majority of shipowners and captains there were honest men. Port Cale was the home of more shady operations, as Tennyson, and then Will, had discovered. "Had any luck?" Horace asked. While he and Halt had stayed to tidy up things in Dunkilty, Will had gone ahead to trail Tennyson and discover where he was heading. The young ranger shrugged now. "Some," he said, "good and bad, I'm afraid. Tennyson has fled the country, as you thought, Halt." Halt nodded. He'd expected as much. "Where did he go?" Will shifted his weight uneasily from one foot to the other. Halt smiled to himself. He knew that his former apprentice hated to fail at any task Halt set him. That's the bad news, I'm afraid. I can't find out. I know who took him. It was a smuggler called the Black O'Malley, but he won't tell me anything. I'm sorry, Halt, he added. His old mentor shrugged. I'm sure you did all you could. Sailors in a place like this can be notoriously close-mouthed. Perhaps I'll have a talk to him. Where do we find him, this exotically named O'Malley character? There's a tavern by the docks. He's there most evenings. Then I'll talk to him tonight, Halt said. Will shrugged. You can try, but he's a hard case, Halt. I'm not sure you'll get anything out of him. He's not interested in money. I tried that. Well, perhaps he'll do it out of the goodness of his heart. I'm sure he'll open up to me, Halt said easily. But Horace noticed a quick gleam in his eye. He was right. The prospect of having something to do had reawakened Halt's spirits. He had a score to settle, and Horace found himself thinking that it didn't bode well for this Black O'Malley character. Will still eyed Halt doubtfully, however. You think so? Halt smiled at him. People love talking to me, he said. I'm an excellent conversationalist, and I have a sparkling personality. Ask Horace. I've been bending his ear all the way from Dunkilty, haven't I? Horace nodded confirmation. Talking non-stop all the way he's been, he said. Be glad to see him turn all that chatter onto someone else. Will regarded the two of them balefully. He had hated admitting failure to Halt. Now his two companions seemed to think the whole matter was a joke, and he simply wasn't in the frame of mind to appreciate it. He tried to think of something crushing to say, but nothing came to him. Finally, he swung up into Tug's saddle and moved out onto the road with them. I've got us rooms at an inn in the upper town. It's quite clean and reasonably priced, he told them. That caught Horace's attention. What's the food like? He asked. They stood back a few meters from the end of the alley, concealed in the shadows. From their position, they had a clear view of the entrance to the Heron, and they could see customers coming and going, without being seen themselves. So far, there had been no sign of O'Malley and his two friends. Will shifted restlessly. It was getting close to midnight. They're late, if they're coming, he said softly. They were here well before this last night. Maybe they were early last night, Horace suggested. Halt said nothing. Why not wait inside, Halt? Horace asked. The night was cold, and he could feel the damp chill rising through the soles of his boots into his feet and legs. His calves were beginning to ache. Cold, wet cobblestones, he thought. The worst possible surface to stand around on. He wanted to stamp his feet to get the blood flowing, but he knew that any such action would earn a quick reprimand from Halt. I want to surprise them, Halt said. If they walk in and see us waiting, the surprise will be lost. If we wait till they're seated, then go in quickly, we'll catch them before they have much of a chance to react to us. Plus, there's always the chance that if we're waiting for them in there, someone will nip out and tell them. Horace nodded. It all made sense. He wasn't big on subtlety himself, but he could recognize it in others. And Horace, Halt began. Yes, Halt? If I give you the signal, I'd like you to take care of this smuggler's two henchmen. Horace grinned broadly. It didn't sound as if Halt expected him to be subtle about that. Fine by me, Halt, he said. Then, as a thought struck him, what will the signal be? Halt glanced at him. I'll probably say something like, Horace. The tall warrior cocked his head to one side. Horace what? That's it, Halt told him. Just Horace. Horace thought about it for a few seconds, then nodded, as if seeing the logic. Good thinking, Halt. Keep it simple. Sir Rodney says that's the way to do it. Anything particular you want me to do? Will asked. Watch and learn, Halt told him. Will smiled wryly. He was over his disappointment about his inability to get O'Malley to talk. Now he was strangely eager to see how Halt handled the matter. He had no doubt that Halt would handle it, somehow. That never changes, does it? He said. Halt glanced at him, sensing the change in his mood, the eagerness that had replaced his disappointment. Only a fool thinks he knows everything, he said, and you're no fool. Before Will could respond, he gestured towards the narrow street. I think our friends have arrived. O'Malley and his 2 henchmen were making their way up the street from the docks. The 3 Araluen watched as they entered the tavern, the 2 bigger men standing aside to let their captain go first. There was a brief hubbub of raised voices as the door opened, spilling light out onto the street. Then noise and light were cut off as the door shut again behind them. Horace started forward, but Halt laid a restraining hand on his arm. Give it a minute or 2, he said. They'll get their drinks and then clear out anyone who might be sitting at their table. Where is it relative to the door, Will? He asked. The young ranger frowned as he pictured the layout of the room. Halt already knew the answer to his question. He'd quizzed Will earlier in the afternoon, but he wanted to keep the young man's mind occupied. Inside, down 2 steps and half right, about 3 meters from the door, by the fireplace. Watch your head on the doorframe, Horace, he added. He sensed Horace nodding in the shadows. Halt was standing, eyes closed, measuring off the seconds, picturing the scene inside the tavern. Will fidgeted, wanting to get moving. Halt's low voice came to him. Take it easy. There's no rush. Will took several deep breaths, trying to calm his racing pulse. You know what I want you to do? Halt asked him. He'd briefed the 2 of them that afternoon in the inn, but it never hurt to make sure. Will swallowed several times. I'll stay inside the door and keep an eye on the room. And remember, not so close to the door that you'll be knocked over if someone comes in unexpectedly, Halt reminded him. But there was no need for that reminder. Halt had drawn a graphic picture that afternoon of how awkward it might be if Will was suddenly knocked flat by an eager drinker shoving the door open to get in. Got it, Will said. His mouth was a little dry. Horace, you're clear? Stay with you. Keep standing when you sit. Watch the 2 bully boys, and if you say, Horace, whack them. Very succinct, Halt said. Couldn't have put it better myself. He waited a few more seconds, then stepped out of the shadows. They crossed the street, and Halt jerked the door open. Will felt the wave of heat and noise and light once again, then stepped inside after Halt and moved to the side. He was conscious of a dull thud and a muffled "Damn!" from Horace as he forgot to duck under the doorway. O'Malley, his back to the fire, looked up at the new arrivals. He recognized Will, and that distracted him for a few seconds, so that he was too late to react to Halt, striding quickly across the room to pull out a stool at the table and sit facing him. Good evening, said the bearded stranger. My name's Halt, and it's time we had a chat.